Welcome, everyone. I had to say this is one of the happiest event introductions I've ever had to make, and mainly because it's all local. I mean, it is, and you'll see this. It is the subject is Montauk. It's four men who vanished at sea and the survivors they left behind. It's a beautiful cover, and a fabulous book that will stand the test of time. And so there's Montauk and Amanda, who lives in Sag Harbor and is well known to all of us, and the threesome certainly all work together. Amanda's a journalist who's worked in the editorial department of the New York Times as a reporter for HuffPost and at the East Hampton Star, where she wrote investigative stories, features, and profiles. She's a graduate of Smith. She's taught with Teach for America. She has 2 master's degrees, and she's really one of all of us. So, and congratulations to you, Amanda. We're really also happy for you. And David is the owner and editor of the East Hampton Star, which has been in his family for 86 years. He's also the founder and a driving force behind the Plain Sight Project, which is an investigation and documentation of the history of East Hampton's slave-owning past. So again, welcome to David, who is a great friend of the bookstores. And I was just saying to him that every week we love doing these events, and David is really so wonderful for supporting the promotion of these events and letting you all hear about them. And Biddle Duke, also a newspaper publisher and journalist. His work has appeared in the New York Times and the New Yorker Online, and he's the founding editor of the East Hampton Star's East Magazine, which is another fabulous magazine included in the East Hampton Star. So welcome all of you. And again, this is really, it's like we're all home together.
Thank you, Carolyn. This is really a wonderful moment. So thank you for making the time, everyone, for me to be here. I just actually picked up my old mug from the East Hampton Star kitchen, which is very pleased to be here. And all 3 of us, just so you know, watching at home, we're all sitting in the offices of East Hampton Star, where myself and Biddle used to work and David works. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Go ahead. No, it's really welcome, everyone. It's nice to meet you, Carolyn, and nice to see everyone here. And this is great. This is a wonderful event. It's an amazing book. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's fun. Amanda's essentially sitting at the desk she sat at to cover school boards and who knows what during her tenure here. And it's just kind of funny to see it come, if not full circle, sort of part circle back. And this project is just amazing. And I think that it's one of those ones I think in retrospect it was screaming out for a book, but I don't know. It took Amanda and maybe Biddle's urging to make this happen, and it's very exciting to be a part of this tonight.
So Amanda, really picking up on Dave's thread there. It's been 5 years since you and I had that conversation on this floor about The Wind Blown. I think I actually couldn't remember the name of the vessel at the time. I knew there was the word wind in it. And it's taken you 5 years. That's a long time. Did you ever get a sense in that process that I can't do this, or what? Tell us about the journey a little bit.
Absolutely. So as you recall, it was the winter of 2016, and you had just arrived to launch East, which is actually back for Memorial Day. We'll get to that later. But we were brainstorming story ideas, and you said, there's this great untold story of the so-called Hamptons, and it's about these 4 men on this boat, and they died in this horrific storm, and it's also about Mary, the young widow who was left behind. And I remember asking you, well, this sounds like it's obvious, why is it that you don't want to write the story? And I remember you saying to me, well, it's complicated and I'm too close to it, and it really needs sort of an outsider to come in and do it justice. And at the time, obviously, we were only thinking in terms of a magazine story. And that summer, of course, Mary wasn't available, and I moved to the West Coast. And there was just something about the essence of this story, even when I was living in California, that I couldn't quite let go of. And it was sort of the beginning, now looking back on it, the beginning of an obsession. And so I didn't really start reporting the book until the fall of 2017. So it's not quite 5 years. And then I sold the book in the winter of 2018. And gosh, I think that the sheer amount of time involved, I did over 100 interviews. Many of those sources I interviewed for dozens of hours at a time over multiple occasions and, over weeks and months. And I had to become an expert on all manner of different things that I actually absolutely nothing about: commercial fishing and surfing and grief and loss and trauma and the East End and how much it's changed from, 1984 to present. And what really drew me into the story, I think truly looking back, were the women who were left behind, the widow and the mothers and the girlfriends who would try and piece themselves back together in the aftermath, some obviously more successfully than others. So it did take me a while, but I think all books take a good 2 to 3 years from what I've understood, nonfiction at least.
Yeah. Do you, there's something about, there was something about the book, when I think back at that conversation that we had, I had an idea of the 4 men who, I had 4,000 words, 5,000 words in my mind, here you're delivering the magazine, you're delivering on the assignment 5 years later. It's kind of amusing, by the way. The East, it's in East, as you mentioned. But there was something about that story that, for me, the story was the 4 men who disappeared and the 2 guys that I knew. And you're right. I mean, when you mentioned that I said I couldn't do the story, I couldn't. It was just too close. I knew 2 of the guys on the boat, and I knew some of the survivors. And I guess thinking back at that moment, I felt like I was releasing something to you, as David said, that was way bigger than I recognized. And for me, seeing the book has been kind of traumatic. Seeing it taken by an outsider. So I mean, it's a tragic tale. It's a sad story. It's a powerful story. But you touched on that in what you just said. I couldn't have done what you did, for sure. We've talked a little bit about over the last year. We've talked about how did I do, and when I think about that, it's impossible for me to even judge that. You've done something that was way beyond what I expected. 4,000 or 5,000 words, and I think you've delivered 100,000. And
Bill, you said something interesting there, about what you expected. And that's something I've wondered about, Amanda, whether you expected, first of all, for this to be an interesting project to you, and second of all, for it to grow to hundreds of interviews and hundreds of thousands of words of notes. Did you know at the beginning that this was interesting to you, even somehow?
How did you know?
How did
you?
I would say Mary was really, the 4 men dying at sea was of interest, but really, honestly, of passing interest, just as a genre of reporting and writing. And it was really Mary Stedman, who
the captain's wife,
who first just captivated me. She has a photographic memory, and we would talk for hours at a time. Often by the end of our 3 or 4 hour long interview, I'd be lying on the floor with the recorder on, just listening to her, describe an afternoon, a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1984, in such, precise detail. And then, every time we would get off the phone, she would pass along 5 sources and 5 more sources after that. And suddenly, obviously, I had tens of thousands of interview notes. But even when I sold the book, actually, I went back recently, a friend had asked to see the proposal. And, I sold sort of like the first layer of the story because that was all that I really knew at the time. And it wasn't until another year and a half would go by of reporting that, all of these other sort of hidden layers revealed themselves. So I feel like, journalists have to have kind of a good sort of sixth sense of what makes a good story. And there was some, all along, I felt like there was a deeper story, a richer story, a truer story that I wasn't quite getting access to, if that makes any sense. More of an intuitive sense, I guess, than anything. And that was really where my obsession sort of took over, and then I wanted to learn about golden tilefish, and then I wanted, and then obviously, there's just incredible documentation of photographs, and the stars photographs are in this book, and they just help tell the story in a way that I could never.
Yeah, it's such sensitive material to the people who survived that some didn't talk to you. And some stopped talking to you.
Yes, I would say, of the more than 100, individuals that I reached out to interview, I would say maybe 3 or 4 did not want to talk with me. So a huge majority were willing and happy to go on the record about that. And then, yes, of course, I think after, once it became clear that my reporting was taking me down these different trajectories, some people grew quite incensed that, it had become larger than they had imagined, and it was out of their control at that point. And that happens a lot to journalists. You often begin a relationship with a source, and you're very, very close, and they bring you along, and then there's often a disruption of that closeness, and that's just part of the work that we do oftentimes.
I think there's so many remarkable details in the book. Mary Stedman's memory of what people were wearing on specific days, and the fisherman who provides you with, I think it's the weather log, and the access you were able to get through, I guess, your persistence and these connections was really remarkable. And in the preface, I think, to the book, you make a note that this is a work of journalistic nonfiction, and I think that's really important to get across to the audience, that this is an accurately reported story about something that happened a long time ago that was very private. And in that, I think it's kind of a remarkable achievement that you were able to win that degree of participation. I mean, that is no easy task, to get that degree of cooperation from people. And that's something that really struck me about the many layers of the richness of this book is in the many, many, many people you're able to bring into it.
It's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
It's a tremendous responsibility.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if we've adequately outlined what the book is really about. I think we've sort of danced around the...
No spoiler alerts, David. No spoiler alerts.
We danced around the edges, but we could plug the East excerpt, I suppose. But this was a story that we grew up with in a way here, that we all sort of knew a little bit about, that there's this tragic sinking. But I think, it became a story that we only knew a little bit about. And I think that's what, in some ways for me reading the book, I'm experiencing a bit of a voyage of discovery, I think not unlike you had, Amanda, in reporting this. And
one of my best friends was supposed to be on that boat.
Yeah.
Tom McGivern.
Right.
And I spoke with him today.
He's in the book. Yeah.
He's in the book.
There's a good picture of Tom.
Just to give you a sense, Dave, as you just said, of how close this is to this community. He decided to take this is in the book. Amanda reports this. He decided to take a surfing trip. He was, 23, 24 at the time, I think. Surfing trip to the Canary Islands. And because he was away on that surfing trip, he wasn't on that vessel. Yeah. And, that's a huge thing for him to carry too. And he carries it. He's carried it his whole life. Did you ever, Amanda, think when you started getting some major pushback from survivors, including people who stopped talking to you. Am I doing this right? Am I doing something wrong? Should I stop doing this?
Well, as you know, since you were sort of my therapist, my book therapist for this project,
I thought that was me.
No, you were. I wrestled with, what layers to include, what to exclude, and there were many, many things that were shared with me off the record that will never appear, in printed form. And I'd like to share, this is sort of the PG version of what occurred. There were certain elements that I didn't feel at liberty to share. But I was listening to a podcast yesterday, driving back from signing books, and a nonfiction writer was talking about how, it's our job, part of the work we do as journalists, is to tell the truth. And it's not really our responsibility to deal with the aftermath. I can only take ownership over so much. I wrote the best book I could. I'm hugely empathetic to everyone that I interviewed, to all of the family members in particular. But at the end of the day, this is the true story of what happened. It's my version of what happened. And I feel okay with that. I really, really do.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me the way the book begins with the incident itself and frames the whole story that follows. Was that something that you thought about to begin with structurally? It's like a meteorite hits, and then there's all of these ripple effects that go through the community and grow through these families. Did you come to that structure late in the process, or did you know as you were reporting it that it was going to go this way? What was that like for you?
As my editor will attest, the great Jackie Cantor, it went through many, many different drafts. The structure was the hardest nut of this thing to crack, and it could still possibly be reordered differently and better, possibly. I wanted the reader to know at the outset what the inherent dramatic tension was. Like, we start the book knowing that these guys don't ever make it back home again. And yet most of the drama, unlike The Perfect Storm, unlike a lot of books based at sea, most of the drama obviously occurs on land, and we sort of toggle through in time, and later on in the book, we're back in search for the remains. But no, I didn't know that structure going into it. I really just had never written a book before, and so I reported in after 3 books on this topic, to be perfectly honest with you, and it was just like, I just kept going off in all of these different directions. And a friend that had, a recent reader who had just read it said it felt like she was reading the book of a woman's obsession, that it was like, now we're in Golden Tilefish, and I bet she's going to bring me, like, we're going to kind of go off in all of these different zigzags, and you just have to kind of like trust me to go on the ride.
You also, one of the, Golden Tilefish, but you also described East Hampton, this whole area, at a time that will no longer be. At an amazing moment when basically this place was becoming what's known now as the Hamptons. It was sort of right on the cusp. And that's a very interesting part of the book, I think, and it's threaded throughout.
Yeah, I agree. There's somewhat of a loss of innocence sub-theme that feels very universal here. Yeah.
I just want to go back to this point. A lot of your really good work, Amanda, both the piece that you did recently for the New York Times about Stephanie, is it Reese?
Stephanie Reese, that's right.
Yeah. Cold water swimming and the really tragic story of Stephanie's. And the stories that I recall you doing for the Star about housing for the Hispanic community and other issues. You're driven to do, just for expedience sake, good. The journalism you do, you seek to do good. You seek to expose the truth, as you just said, because you hope some positive change will come about as a result. What's the good of this project?
Well, as I mentioned, I began the book really so close to Mary, and that at a certain point, Chris, her eldest son, really kind of took me along on his version of what had occurred. And getting to know him very well and deeply and over the course of our many, many, many conversations. And I flew also to Kauai to meet him. I think his story at the end is one of healing and reconciliation with the past. And there, I think, is also another universal thread that anyone can relate to that's dealt with any degree of loss and trauma. I feel like in the aftermath of our pandemic, or sort of this weird in-between time, but a lot of us have reevaluated the kind of work that we want to be doing or not doing, or time spent versus not. And I think increasingly, I just want to do stories that touch me, some part of me very deeply. So that was certainly the case with Stephanie, and that's certainly the case with this story. That it has to kind of check that box for me at this point in my career, for me to want to invest that level of emotional energy as well. I mean, this story, I became quite sick at one point when I was working on it. I mean, this was really intense. For a year and a half, all I did was talk to people about grief and loss, and men were breaking down, and it was uncomfortable at times to handle that and to be carrying that around and having it living in my head, that heavy, heavy thing. And it really wasn't until Chris took me along on his journey to kind of put himself back together, where like this bright, shred of light entered into it. And I was like, oh, not only is this the end of my book, but this is the only hopeful part of this whole goddamn thing. Like, this is really dark. And this, finally we have like an aspect of hopefulness. And that, until that, it was quite bleak, honestly, the writing and the reporting of it.
That part of the story is very powerful. And the ending is very powerful. I don't want to blow it, but it's a very strong part of the book. If you're going to mention Chris, I know too much. I just want to mention that Mary has two other sons. All three of them are remarkable athletes and a remarkable men. The two others, Will and Shane, wouldn't speak with you, unfortunately, because I think they would offer a perspective. They would have offered a perspective that I think would have been hugely valuable. But you'll have to read the book to understand perhaps why they didn't speak to you.
One of the things about this story and this book that's really a question for me is, we've had other tragedies here, other seafaring tragedies, but there was something about this one in particular, and maybe Biddle, you have a sense of this too. Why this one? Why is this the one that sort of stuck with people, that left such a hole in the community? What was it about this that reached that sort of other level, sort of beyond mourning, sort of a symbolic loss for all of us?
Amanda, I have my thoughts.
Well, I think 1984 as an inflection point is just an interesting time, here, specifically on the East End. It was before the crazy Wall Street bonuses, it was just a simpler time. And I think you can also associate that with the loss of innocence, with a whole generation sort of coming of age and mourning the loss of their youthfulness. But also, I think one particular part about the story is the absence of closure. And the fact that these bodies were never found, the fact that the whole of the boat has never been found. I mean, there were pieces of the boat that turned up during the search and what have you. But that absence of closure, as humans, we need sort of that period at the end of a sentence, or we need to see a body dead in front of us in order to kind of process what that means. And without that, I just think it's a devastating loss, even more so.
Wow, Amanda. So I have an additional thing, as you.
Oh, good Lord.
I mean, there were two men on that boat whose families did not want them on that boat, as you well know. I'm not talking about their direct families. I'm talking about their broader families. The captain's father. I mean, the anecdote that you had in the book, or that you have in the book, I don't know if you want me to tell it, but it's just amazing. That scene in the bank is that's some incredible reporting. Can I tell people about that?
Yes, you can. Please go ahead.
Captain goes to the bank with a check that he's absolutely elbowed his way into his father's good graces to write a check for for deposit on down payment on the boat. And he presents the check to the cashier, and correct me if this is a little off. And the cashier, and he, gives it to the clerk at the bank, and the clerk hands it back. Says, "I can't cash this. Why not? Look at the signature line," she says to the captain. And he looks at the signature line, and it says, "Not on your life.
Over my dead body."
Over my dead body.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one of the reasons. Like, he was absolutely out there in defiance of his father, and that's big. That's big.
It is big. I mean, there's certainly a huge strain of rebellion running through this story, right? That's like a very, very specific through line that became clear early on. And what I did find so fascinating, you had mentioned that 2 of the fathers didn't want them on the boat. Well, the other 2 fathers weren't any less complicated. All 4 of them had very, very, very challenging relationships with their fathers, whether their fathers, had been alcoholics or absent. One of the fathers had already, he had gone missing on a fishing boat. He had died at sea. The other one never had a father. I mean, they all, I'm not suggesting that they were out longlining and chatting about their father issues. Not by any stretch of the imagination, but this is this sort of intense primal bond that they shared, which I think was a huge part of their identity and what informed them, and what sort of compelled them to be on that boat, risking their lives and doing this kind of work. They were out there to prove themselves in this kind of very, very kind of authentic, I think, search for one's identity and meaning in the world. And I think a lot of that was in large part a rejection of what their fathers had wanted for them. Certainly the case for Captain Stedman and for Dave Connick.
Yeah, there's no question. I think it's fascinating the way women tell this story, in a sense, for us. Alice Connick, for example, the time you spent with her really struck me as quite powerful and kind of a unique piece of reporting. I can't really think of a parallel to those scenes with her. Was it difficult to sit with her, for example, and go through such painful private parts of her life?
Yes, I remember, it was I flew, we were still living in California at the time, and I flew back for one of the anniversaries. I believe that was in March 29th, 2018. And I specifically wanted to be here with the family members and how it was that they processed that day, that anniversary. And for many of them, the whole month of March is really still very, very problematic. And I remember driving over to Alice's house. I'll never forget it. I was very, very nervous. I knew I would have one opportunity to spend the morning with her, and one time only. And I had been told all of these kinds of different stories about who she had been as a much younger woman and how people remembered her. And she just couldn't have been lovelier and more welcoming and inviting. And, I think what another thing that this story has shown me is that even these really hard parts of our lives, we often just want someone to listen and bear witness to it. And I certainly got that sense of her. It was quite incredible. I mean, she had very late stage Parkinson's at that point. She passed away this past fall, unfortunately. But her mind was incredibly lucid. And like many of the survivors, that her memory was sort of frozen in time from that era, and what it had meant to lose her youngest son, and how she went to her grave carrying that loss, that deep, deep loss. So it was a very moving interview, and it's really been nothing quite like that. So thank you for that observation, Dave.
Yeah, that was really, for me, the sort of like stop and put down the book moment. I can't really say why, except I think it must have, some of what you were experiencing must have come through as well. And it was, she speaks about her husband, and it's extraordinarily moving. which gets me to sort of something that you and Biddle have both said, which is, this is not a book about a shipwreck. This is a people story set in a time and set in a place and around an event. And that strikes me as, a very impressive and complicated achievement to have done that. And I mean, do you think about your readers and sort of who's going to be reading this and, what they're going to take out of it? Because it feels like there's so many threads to this story that you'll have certain sorts of readers, who will see this as a fishing yarn sort of gone bad, and others who will really tune into these lives that are fractured. And
yeah, will someone in Indiana pick this up and
maybe that's a better way to put it, Biddle.
Certainly. I mean, obviously this is ground zero for our readers of who will be interested in it. I think up and down the East Coast, coastal communities can relate to this aspects of the story. But I have already gotten some really lovely notes from readers all over the country. The booksellers, some indie booksellers were given early copies, and obviously not everyone loves any book. So I certainly have been, I've already received my fair share of terrible reviews online by random strangers on the internet and what have you. But I have also gotten some really lovely heartfelt notes from folks who have never set foot here and maybe never will, and really kind of responded to more of the universal themes of loss and memory and what that does to us as humans. So that's been lovely. But I agree. I don't know, for instance, like what the average reader in Wichita will think of this book, but I'm so curious to hear.
But the universality of this really does come through, and I hope that readers more broadly see it, because in a way it is about a real place, not the sort of glitzy one that we're sold now on reality TV shows about the high life in the Hamptons. And I think it's been a while since we've been sort of depicted collectively as a real place, and I think that's one of the things that I'm sure you worked hard at in the piece, in the book. But that's for me. I think that's one of the more exciting aspects of it, is the sense of a fairly accurate depiction of what made and makes this community tick in its complexity.
Dave, I want to return to that point and ask you about the future, what your view of the future commercial fishing industry is. But I just want to double back on one thing. Amanda, in the narrative, in the story you describe, and I'm not sure this came out. I think I remember rereading the coverage of the windblown tragedy back from 1984, and I'm not sure this was in that coverage, but it's certainly in Amanda's book, that the boat was not suitable for the North Atlantic in the winter, in big seas, or at least people knew that. And I think when you asked the question, Dave, one of the other points, when you asked the question of why this is something that's stayed with us, I think a lot of people have regret, maybe not guilt per se, but have I don't know, it comes through in Amanda's book that I didn't know, but people did know that it wasn't, is that right, Amanda? Is that correct? I mean, that it wasn't
I think that's true for a very small share of the population that were here at the time that observed it up close. And yeah, I think a lot of them have since felt like, well, why didn't I say something? Or why didn't I sort of more forcefully speak up? That, a lot of guys were chasing a dream in this era, which I go into in the mid 80s, and there was great money to be made. And they weren't all captaining these, pristine, perfect vessels. These were like, a lot of them were young kids going out to do this work. So yeah, I mean, it is a story of hubris and decision-making and hate, possibly. But yeah.
The trajectory of the Windblown's history is fascinating, Amanda, and I wonder if you could give us the sort of 2-second description of where that vessel started and how it evolved.
Right, right. So thank you for that. So the Windblown actually was a Long Island-based vessel. It was a gentleman in Captree, Long Island, which is farther up island, sort of bought it as a party boat, and at one point decided to expand it. The boat, I think, originated in the mid '60s.
What's a party boat? That may not be clear to everyone.
Also, right, I didn't know what a party boat was. So a party boat. I need to do like a glossary.
It's not a boat for partying, okay?
Far from it.
I also had no idea what a party boat was. So excellent question. So a party boat is a boat that you would go on as a like someone such as myself who wanted to go out and catch fish, one morning or afternoon. But it's for what? For non-professionals, for recreation.
Like a day fishing boat, basically.
Yeah,
that you,
right.
You
would buy
pay
it for a day. You buy a ticket, you go on, you'd bring your fishing gear, and you catch whatever you caught, and you bring it home. And there was a long, long, long history of that here in this area. Certainly from city dwellers coming out and going out to Montauk for the day and what have you. But this boat that Mike Stedman sort of saw and grew, sort of fixated with, originated in Long Island. And by the time he saw it in the fall of '83, it had gone all the way down to Galveston, Texas, and was on sort of, an oil rig ferrying passengers back and forth. And for whatever reason, this was the boat that he needed to have. And he was flipping through a magazine with different advertisements, and he just decided this is the one, this is the boat I need to get, and went. There's a whole part of the book where he and his crew go down to Texas to drive it back up to Montauk, and that would have been in January of '84, and the boat went down in March of '84. So he really didn't have this boat for very long.
How many trips did he make out of Montauk before the fateful one?
Not very many. Probably. I mean, memories were mixed. I would say six tops.
Just to jump back to the boat for a second, you mentioned it in passing, but this really struck me as a boater myself, that the original vessel was steel, I think, and it was expanded by 15 feet, which was not the way the designer intended it. And in addition, they built a plywood wheelhouse, if I remember, and that's one thing that the sort of Montauk dock rats notice when Stedman wheels this thing back into Montauk Harbor, right? That this is kind of an unusual looking boat, even by Montauk standards.
There were other modifications, right, Amanda?
Yes, they had taken, because there was the wooden pilot house, which was unusual. Typically, it would be made with steel, right? Is that right, Dave?
Yeah.
So it was wooden pilot house, and then because of a lack of space on the actual deck, they put the long line on the very, very top of the boat.
The long line.
The drum.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah, the drum. Right. So that was thousands of. That was really heavy piece of machinery, thousands of tons probably. Mm-hmm. So that just only, not only, I guess, again, I'm hardly a nautical engineer, although I did speak to a few. So I guess anytime you take a vessel and then you add on to it, that's sort of a mark in the negative direction. And then obviously if you're adding a very, very heavy piece of machinery on top of it, that's sort of added to its unseaworthiness, and would have likely been fine had it not confronted this really horrific storm at a really inopportune moment. It's not as though they were just out on a gorgeous, early spring day. They were caught in a horrible storm.
Mm.
Have you shared the book with members of with survivors, and what's the reaction been?
I just sent the book out last week to various family members, and I am waiting to hear back. I have gotten a few notes, but everyone's reading it currently, so I'm eager to hear what they think.
That's an interesting point. We chose to run an excerpt in East Magazine, aware of how there were people to this day who felt maybe this is a book that shouldn't have been written or shouldn't have been done this way. And I admit feeling nervous about putting the excerpt into the magazine. It's clearly the right thing to do, but I wonder, we'll know maybe by the weekend if there are people who are outraged by this. They shouldn't be. I think if they read the work, they'll understand. But I think there may be kind of a reaction within the community, like how dare the star, how dare this Amanda Fairbanks person do this? You know, even if you're not in the fishing community here, there's a certain tight-knit quality, and I think we all, I'm sure you've thought about this as well, Biddle. You know, you sort of tread carefully when you go into a personal tragedy like this.
I mean, Amanda, jump in, but I'm just going to say this. You know, the downing of a fishing vessel is a matter of public record, and it's a matter of public concern. And the private lives of the people left behind, that's another matter. And I think that's what you're talking about, Dave. Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about private lives, but just to be clear, every single person that I interviewed multiple times.
Yeah, of course.
You know, everything is on the record. I'm telling a story about a history that is soon to be lost, the ravages of time that no one will ever again speak of. And I believe that there's value added in telling these family histories, and that all of us are products of similar environments when we get to the core of our lives, of our truth. So I will push back with you on that a little bit. It's not as though I went breaking into people's homes and, was like sifting through private diaries. This is all information that was willingly and openly shared with me, private correspondence that was shared with me, and much of it were public records that I found as doing my due diligence. But yeah.
I think the inadequacy of the vessel itself, as well as the decisions made during that last voyage, are the ones in some ways that I feel will be where a reaction will come from. It's that sort of sense of, that there's clearly this mistake that's made. This vessel is not right for the job. And we're sort of saying so in East, we're saying so in you're saying so in the book. And it's funny, it's not the personal stuff per se that I worry about so much, but this sort of admission of this fundamental flaw, both sort of in thinking and in the structure of the boat. It's hard to explain why, but that's the point at which I think we may really touch a nerve. And that's that core idea that none of them should have been there. And that maybe, I guess, is the most painful thing for the family still. That comes across in the book at any rate for me.
It'll be interesting to see what the response will be. Yeah.
We hope there's a response. I mean, I think that's what we want.
Any response is a great response. And just so that everyone's clear, the first chapter and all of the beautiful photographs are out in the Memorial Day issue of East.
Yeah, the cover is of the magazine as well is only sort of partially related, but it's by a guy named Tom Ford, and I think that your connection to him is one of the examples of how sort of what kind of a deep dive you did into Montauk, really going back to the 1970s, and it's not only a remarkable piece of reporting, but also sort of collection of images and sense of place. I think for me, the sense of place that this book brings back is really powerful. When a time when East Hampton and the Hamptons weren't quite so manicured and clean, and everything was perfect, and we had, all our boats had wonderful electronics and the whole bit. There's a nostalgia, despite the tragedy, that I find very evocative, very satisfying.
There's a big surfing thread in the book too, which is beautifully told, and so for me nostalgic, because the 60s and the 70s, when Mike Steadman and Dave Connick were surfing here, those were sort of the pioneering days of surfing here. And Amanda, you write about the early days when Bird on the Roof and Albatross, and Ray Charon's surf shop. God, that just was so, it just took me back. The reporting in the book is just unbelievable. That's so deep. Yeah.
I think there's a degree of pride for us at the Star that you were here, you know, for a time. It's always great to see our alums go on to things like this. And so it's gratifying in a sort of selfish way, you know.
Thank you, David, for hiring me. I was in like a post-baby haze, and I was like, get me the hell out of my house. I've got to go back to doing some reporting and writing. So I have nothing but good memories.
Yeah.
Amanda, Dave, Biddle, we do have some questions rolling in from our audience.
Okay,
Amanda, can you talk about what it felt like to finish this book after all of the research and the interviewing that went into it, and then finally get to send it out into the world?
So how it feels very surreal to be sitting here at the Star, talking with these two gentlemen, colleagues of mine. It feels also like a huge relief to share this story, which has been living for so long in my head, and the different iterations of it. And I'm quite proud of it. So I'm happy to share it with our readers.
What do you want, or what's your hope for readers after they read the book? What do you want them to take away from it?
Oh, I haven't even thought of that. I think just a further reflection of families and secrets and histories, and learning about maybe the intricacies of a place. For instance, if you're a summer person that has only been here on weekends, that this is a place occupied, you know, year round by real people living, you know, real lives, and all of that complexity.
If you could have one particular person read this book, who would it be?
One particular person? Oh, good Lord. Do I have a good suggestion?
One or two or three?
Well, I guess I don't really have an exact readership. Yeah, I'm just curious to see how it resonates with different kinds of readers and different places, I guess.
All right. That's all the questions we have for right now, and we will continue taking your questions as you send them in to our audience.
Amanda, I would think you'd want some, you know, interesting writer or actor that you've always wanted to meet read your book. No, I mean, come on, this is an opportunity here.
That would be good. I have had, yes, that would be great if a brilliant screenwriter read it and
exactly.
Turning it into
Aaron Sorkin. I want Aaron Sorkin to read my book, you know.
Wow, I would love Aaron Sorkin to read this book.
Amanda, do you think that you'll return to this sort of general theme in subsequent work, the sort of examination of relationships and family, regardless of whether it's a shipwreck or
definitely,
you know?
I definitely won't do another shipwreck. That will be off the table.
Sinking, rather. Sinking.
Right, sinking. But I am endlessly fascinated by families and dynamics within those families, and things sort of appearing one way and then they suddenly become quite another. All of those things are of endless fascination to me, truly.
Another question we just got in: what was your favorite book to read as a child? And favorite book to share with your children?
Oh, my favorite book to read as a child. I was really obsessed with Beverly Cleary's Ramona series as a young girl. I loved that. And my favorite book to read with my children, gosh, so many things. We just recently read Soul Week, which I love, by Lupita Nyong'o. It's a beautiful book. I'll keep working on that. It's probably for my mother.
What do you think about a movie?
Movie. Well, I've had some interest in optioning it. It has not been optioned, but we are in conversations with various different producers that are interested in that. I often saw it as I was writing it as a moving picture and I think in a different medium, it would obviously be quite a different story.
Yeah, there are cinematic moments. Michael Vigilant and his girlfriend on the dock the day they sail, I think. you know, you can't help but sort of see that visually and imagine it unrolling in front of your eyes.
Or you know, Catherine Cedarquist chasing Dave Connick down the sidewalk after school because she just wants to meet him and wants to. She's seen him and she wants to be with him. Cedarquist, right, Amanda?
That's right.
I mean, that level of reporting is just amazing.
Well, the visuals helped by Mary Stedman's memory, you know, the color of someone's socks at, you know, at a funeral.
Yeah.
She has a remarkable memory, you say in the book, Amanda, right?
Yeah.
She does. I'm not a doctor, but it seems rather photographic to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I assume she's the one who describes what people were wearing at the memorial at Most Holy Trinity Church, or maybe not. It doesn't matter who did it, but that brings you right there. She's wearing a dress. Well, we'll leave this. It's not really a surprise, but those sort of details are not the sort of things you find in ship sinking books, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so satisfying is the richness of detail. The little surprises like that. I think that was for me a part of the book that I don't think I anticipated to have that much. What is it called? I don't know, color or real life. That was remarkable.
So Amanda, sorry, go ahead.
Did you consult with Sebastian Junger at all on how he developed and wrote The Perfect Storm?
No, and funnily enough, Mr. Younger has never responded to me. So.
It's probably
no, actually, I'm not kidding. I did read The Perfect Storm. I think The Perfect Storm is a beautiful book, and most of it takes place at sea during the storm, and it's a brilliant work of journalism. And I didn't want to write that same book, but I totally get the comparison. And I think he's a great writer, and yeah.
Yeah, this is a different story.
Right, but just as David's saying, I think if a typical reader, you know, hoping to go on a seafaring voyage, well, maybe, you know, go on a different sort of a story, and that will either work or not work for them. Yeah.
All right.
So what does the life of an author look like after launch day? So today the book goes live, and you know, what happens for the next, say, I don't know, 3 months? What does your life look like?
Well, another writer who recently took me to lunch in Sag Harbor suggested that I start working on a new project, which I will not discuss what that is, but I'm starting to work on a new project. And then over the course of the next few weeks, I have a mixture of virtual events, such as this one, and then later into June and July, I have a few in-person events, which will be really fun. So.
We have another audience member, Amanda, that's wondering when during the writing and publishing process you sent the book to the families and how you came to that decision of the timing of releasing it to them.
So books typically work written by journalists is not shared with their sources ahead of time, as Dave and Biddle will attest. In this particular instance, given the personal nature of it, with most of my personal family sources, I shared with them versions of different chapters so that I could correct it factually. But the entire manuscript was not shared with anyone until the end of last week, of family members in particular.
I think we have time for one more question. Biddle, Dave?
Well, Dave, earlier, I just mentioned this earlier. You know, this is to a great extent about commercial fishing in Montauk, and that is, you know, a real, it's a locals profession here, and it's one of the things that makes this, as you pointed out earlier, a real place, not just a holiday and vacation weekend place. What is the future of commercial fishing here. And Amanda, if you have a thought on this, please. Montauk is the biggest commercial harbor in New York, I think, fishing harbor, that is.
Dollar value, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that, I can see commercial fishing kind of going on maybe another generation before it really begins to fade. I mean, it's unusual, and it's the last wild harvest for the general table. And here in the United States, it's no longer subsistence fishing. It's really luxury food. And I do wonder if the children of fishing families will want to go into the business and continue. Combined with issues of climate change and the expansion of marine protected areas that may limit access to fishing grounds. I do worry that it may be fading slowly, another generation. But 100 years from now, I think commercial fishing will be largely a thing of the past.
Amanda, you described the tile fishing boom, which I think also was accompanied by a monk fishing boom. I mean, it was a real, a fishing gold rush in Montauk at that time in the 80s. What happened? Where did they go? Did they tile fish move?
According to the fishermen that many, dozens of whom I've interviewed, they were fished out. They, were in such huge huge sizes and populations. And now the ones these guys catch are really tiny. And that's a fascinating, thing that's occurred within one generation, just as David's saying, for these sons and daughters of commercial fishermen to go into this line of work. Not only is it very, very difficult and excruciatingly difficult to make a living, the catch is just getting off, in many cases, for many of the species, smaller and smaller, given the degradation to our natural environment. So I think that's a huge concern. And I agree. I think 100 years from now, if I were to predict, I don't think commercial fishing will be a profession with which one makes a living. I really don't.
Well, Amanda, Biddle, Dave, we're already at that time. An hour just evaporated into thin air. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight and for this discussion. It is our pleasure and honor to be able to host you. And thank you to all of our guests for joining us for tonight's event, for supporting these creatives, these writers, these authors, and your local independent bookstores. The Lost Boys of Montauk. If you've not gotten your copy yet, get it now. It is available. Happy book birthday. Signed copies available at our Hampton location while supplies last. Happy reading and have a great night.